what is psychology and the history of the field. Those are the things that we're going to take a look at in this video. So to begin with, what is psychology? What do we study in psychology? Well, one of the things that we'll learn as we take a look at the history of psychology is that that has changed a little bit over time. Today, many people would agree that the subject of psychology, or the definition of psychology, is that it is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. And we've got a couple of components there. First of all, we talk about mind and behavior as being the subjects of our study in psychology. At different times in the history of psychology, there have been different ideas about exactly what we should focus on. Early in the history, it was the mind that was seen as the subject of our field, and in particular consciousness. But there was a period of time where the focus was on behavior, and it was solely outward observable behavior, so the stuff that we can see taking place. And during that period, very little attention, at least in most of psychology, was paid to some of that stuff that goes on inside the mind. Things that today we might call mental processes. And of course, those are things that many people today recognize as being behaviors as well. But that definition, the study of mind and behavior, is pretty much all-inclusive, and psychology today is much more all-inclusive when it comes to what we study, what we look at, mind and behavior. Another part of that definition that I want to take a look at, we say that it is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. And so that's what makes it a scientific discipline. The fact that in psychology we apply the scientific method. We attempt to study what we study in psychology scientifically. We apply that scientific method. We make observations, we develop hypotheses and theories, and then we test those theories. So while it may be a little bit harder to study some of the things that we study in psychology scientifically, harder than it might be for, say, biologists or chemists, we still attempt to do that. We make every effort to be as scientific as possible in studying these things. So on the slide, says psychologists study everything about the human experience, from the basic workings of the human brain to consciousness, memory, language, reasoning, personality, and mental health. So from that, you probably get a sense that psychology is a very broad field. We cover lots of things in psychology. And of course, in this general class, we do a survey of the entire field. So we're going to touch on many of those different areas throughout the course of this semester. Now, in terms of the history of psychology, throughout the history of psychology, there have been different psychological perspectives. And what you see on the screen now, these are examples of historical psychological perspectives. So starting from the beginning of the field on up, but a little bit later, we're going to talk about contemporary psychology and some of the more contemporary perspectives in the field of psychology. And you'll see that there is a little bit of connection between some of these historical perspectives and those perspectives that we think of as being much more contemporary. But this is just a quick overview. In the slides that follow, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at many of those different areas. So psychology really got its start with this gentleman, Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt is known as being the father of psychology. He's credited as one of the founders of psychology. Now, psychology as a discipline really got its birth with him because he established the first laboratory to study what we study in psychology scientifically. So prior to Wundt's time, people were interested in studying some of the things that we study. They certainly had an interest in learning about a lot of the stuff that we study in psychology, but they weren't really going about that in a scientific way. And so psychology as a discipline prior to that time was not born. And so it wasn't until Wundt in 1879 established the first laboratory to study what we study in psychology in a scientific way that we think of psychology as being birthed. So that's when the discipline got its start as its own discipline, separate from things like philosophy and other disciplines of that nature. Now, with Wundt, he and many of his contemporaries argued that what we should study in psychology is the mind, but in particular, consciousness. So consciousness is a term that will come up through your readings and through our lecture videos a number of times this semester. And consciousness is something that you're probably familiar with in terms of a concept. But consciousness basically consists of everything that you're aware of, everything that you're thinking about, everything that you're experiencing in a given moment. That's what's in your consciousness. And that's what Wundt argued we should study in psychology. But he had a particular view of consciousness. He emphasized what we call structuralism today. That's because when he looked at consciousness as he was studying it, what he was really concerned about was the structure of consciousness. So he wanted to understand the structure, the different parts that make up consciousness. And so that's why his school of thought in psychology is known as structuralism. Now, when he established his laboratory, he also had to try to find a method, a way of studying consciousness that could be seen as a scientific study of consciousness. And so he started using a technique, what's called introspection. And with introspection, what he would ask his subjects to do is just examine their own conscious experience. So he wanted them to pay attention to consciousness, to what they were experiencing at a given time. And as part of that, he wanted to be able to break it down into its component parts, the different parts that make up that awareness. So what Wundt would do, often he would ask subjects to perform a task, something like listening to a metronome. And as they were performing that task, he wanted them to simply observe their consciousness, pay attention to what they experienced, what they were aware of as they were performing that task. So that's where we got our start, and that's where the school of thought in psychology that we call structuralism came into being. Now, throughout that history, there have been a number of different schools of thought because people have focused on slightly different things. And another school of thought that came along in the early days of the history of psychology is what we call functionalism. And functionalism came along with William James. William James was the first American psychologist, and James felt that if we look at those different components of consciousness, if we try to break consciousness down into its individual parts, consciousness loses its meaning. So he felt that what we should be focusing on instead is the functioning or the functionality of consciousness. So that's what he started studying, how consciousness functions, but also how it allows us as humans to function in the world. And so his school of thought in psychology came to be known as functionalism because, again, he was emphasizing how those mental activities allow us to function, how they contribute to our survival in our environment. Now, another name that is often associated with the history of psychology is that of Sigmund Freud. And I would imagine that many of you have probably heard of Sigmund Freud before you ever read about him in your general psych textbook. Freud wasn't actually a psychologist by training. He was a neurologist, but he developed some theories about the mind and about how the mind works. And so he ended up being pretty influential in the field of psychology. One of his books was called A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. And in that book, he wrote about his type of therapy, the type of therapy that he created, what is known as psychoanalytic therapy or psychoanalysis. And it turns out that psychoanalysis is where we probably get many of our ideas about what therapy is supposed to be or what therapy is supposed to involve. Some of the elements that we may imagine when we think about therapy actually do come from Freud and some of his work with psychoanalysis. Freud did have a couch in his office, and in this slide we see a picture of that couch, and he wanted his clients to be comfortable when they came for psychoanalysis. So he would ask them to lie down on the couch, and he wanted them to simply free associate. And again, that's another element that you might think of when you think of therapy. People going into that therapist's office and just talking about whatever comes to mind. And that is free association. That's what Freud wanted his clients to do when he was performing psychoanalysis. So he's known for developing psychoanalysis, but also psychoanalytic theory. And psychoanalysis is actually based on psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory suggests that there are unconscious processes that drive our behavior. So he talked about the idea that there are different levels of consciousness: the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. And in his view, it's that unconscious mind that plays the most significant role in determining our behavior and our personality. So those three levels of consciousness start at the top with consciousness. So that's what we've been talking about so far, what you're aware of, those experiences that you are consciously aware of at a given time. But then he argued that there's a preconscious level. And at that preconscious level, that's stuff that you're not aware of right now, but you could easily make yourself aware of that information. But then the deepest level is what he called the unconscious. And the unconscious, according to Freud, is made up of a lot of stuff: thoughts, feelings, ideas, memories, things like that we're not aware of. And for the most part, we don't really want to be aware of. He argued that a lot of what's in our unconscious mind is stuff that we want to keep there. We want to keep it repressed. We don't want to be aware. We don't want to admit that we have those feelings or that that's part of our experience. So he suggested that we put a lot of energy into keeping that unconscious material repressed. So keeping it out of our conscious awareness. But while we're not aware of it, he again argued that that's what plays the biggest role, the most significant role in determining our functioning and our personality, who we are, that kind of thing. So Freud's theories extend to personality, and we'll come back to some of his ideas later in the semester as we talk about personality and different theories of personality. But he believed that one of the ways we could access that unconscious content was through dream analysis. And that's another one of his pretty well-known books, The Interpretation of Dreams. And that's what he wanted to do in that book, is look at what our dream content means, because he felt that if he could analyze and figure out what those dreams mean, that would give him a clue as to what's in that person's unconscious mind. Other ways of getting at the unconscious mind, he suggested, or at least at the content in that unconscious mind, he suggested that through free association, we could learn about that unconscious content. And so that's what psychoanalysis involved. He would ask his clients to say whatever came to mind as it came to mind. And he would keep a record, because he believed that if people just free associate and they just talk without thinking about what they're saying, just saying whatever comes as it comes, that they would stop screening and some of that unconscious material would come out. So psychoanalytic theory focuses on the role of the unconscious, but it also focuses on early childhood experiences. Freud argued that those things that happen to us in childhood are significant, and so he believed that those things have an impact on our functioning way into life as we get older. And so he tended to pay a lot of attention to unconscious experience. Another school of thought in psychology, sort of a historical school of thought in psychology, was Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology was developed by a number of German psychologists who had immigrated to the U.S. as a way to escape Nazi Germany. So these are some of those individuals: Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer. Their school of thought has been pretty influential in our study of perception. And one of their key ideas, what we might think of as sort of the motto of Gestalt psychology, is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And if you think about it, in that way, their thinking was very similar to that of William James when he suggested functionalism as a school of thought. If you'll remember from a little bit earlier, I mentioned that when he focused on consciousness, he felt that if we take consciousness and break it down into its different components or its individual parts, then consciousness sort of loses its meaning. And that's something that the Gestalt psychologists were known for focusing on, the whole. They looked at things like sensory experience and perception, and they looked at how those things can be broken down into individual parts. But when it comes to perception, what we're really doing is we're taking stimulation and we're perceiving it as a whole. And so this is one of those areas, again, where their ideas have been particularly influential. And we'll come back to some of their ideas as we look at sensation and perception in a few weeks. Now, another school of thought in psychology is what we call behaviorism. And this is when we started getting into a period when we paid attention primarily to behaviors and not the inner workings of the mind. In just a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about the person who's thought of as being the father of behaviorism, but he was really influenced by the work of Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. And again, Pavlov is another name that you might be familiar with. You may have heard that name before. Pavlov is known for discovering classical conditioning, and he discovered it as he was working with dogs in the laboratory. In particular, he was studying the salivation process in dogs, and he knew that salivation was a reflexive response, that when dogs are given food, much like when humans are given food and they start to eat, they automatically begin to salivate. But one of the things that he noticed is that dogs who had been in his laboratory would start to salivate before they were given food. It seemed that there were certain things in their environment that were cueing that reflex or stimulating that reflex, things that they'd come to associate with food because those things had been presented along with food in the past. And so he set up that first classical conditioning experiment where he would ring a bell just before giving dogs food. And he was eventually able to condition dogs to salivate in response to a bell. And that was classical conditioning. And so he demonstrated how certain behaviors can be learned as a result of classical conditioning. Well, this gentleman, John Watson, was really interested and inspired by the work of Pavlov. And Watson believed that all behavior, everything we do, is a result of learning. He believed, much like the philosopher John Locke, that children are born blank slates, or the term that Locke used was tabula rasa, and that we're waiting for the world to write on us with experience. And so he argued that those experiences, like what happens when individuals experience classical conditioning, that's what makes us who we are. That's how we develop certain behaviors, our personality, our styles, those types of things. And so he would argue that all of our behavior is a result of learning, but Watson came along at a time when psychology was really struggling to be viewed as a scientific discipline. And this was sort of on the heels of Freud and some of his ideas, which people reacted pretty strongly to anyway. But Freud was talking about the unconscious mind. And what goes on inside the mind, consciousness, can't be observed directly, or at least in their day could not be observed directly, much less what's in the unconscious mind. So Watson argued that rather than focusing on the mind and conscious experience, what we should focus on in psychology is behavior. And by behavior, he meant simply the outward observable stuff, the stuff that we can see on the outside. So he focused on observable behavior and then looked at different things that we could do to bring that behavior under control. And part of that was his work with classical conditioning. Now, one of his most well-known experiments, probably the most well-known of his experiments, was what we now refer to as the Little Albert study. And in the Little Albert study, what Watson did is he ended up classically conditioning a little boy, 11-month-old Albert, to fear white rats. So initially, little Albert was not afraid of white rats, but through the process of classical conditioning, he trained little Albert to have that fear. It's important to point out that that's not the type of thing that we want to be doing in psychology or really in any discipline, because we don't want to do harm. And of course, that was a very unethical experiment, and Watson got into a lot of hot water as a result of that, as he should. He did demonstrate that those types of things could be conditioned, but his attempts in that area were based on this idea that you could take someone and simply by altering their environment, make them into whatever you want, by training them up in a particular way. Now, as you might imagine, Watson got into some trouble for his little Albert experiment and for other things as well. And so it was really this gentleman, B.F. Skinner, who advanced behaviorism. Skinner, like Watson, was concerned with behavior. And by behavior, he also meant the outward observable stuff. He felt that we shouldn't pay attention to what goes on inside the mind. And in fact, Skinner is known for calling the mind the black box. And he argued that you can't see what's in the black box. You can see what goes into it in terms of environmental conditions. You can see what comes out of it in terms of behavior, but you can't see what's inside that black box. And so he felt that what we should focus on is the stuff that we can see, the environmental stuff, and the behavior on the other end. So he's known for studying the principles of modifying behavior through consequences. He was particularly interested in how behavior is affected by its consequences. Some consequences have the effect of encouraging a behavior, making that behavior more likely in the future, or reinforcing that behavior. Some consequences, on the other hand, have the effect of discouraging behavior, making behavior less likely, punishing behavior. And so that's what he studied, how those consequences, reinforcement and punishment, influence and in turn can modify behavior, what we now call operant conditioning. And a little later in the semester, when we talk about learning, we'll come back to Skinner's ideas about operant conditioning, as well as some of Watson's with regards to classical conditioning as well. Another school of thought in psychology, sort of a historical school of thought, is what's known as humanism. And the humanists were a group of psychologists who took an approach that was pretty different from both Freud and other what were called psychodynamic theorists, as well as the behaviorists. The humanists felt that our behavior is much more complicated and that who we are is much more complicated than what the behaviorists and Freud allowed for. Freud paid so much attention to unconscious processes and how those unconscious processes influence behavior. The behaviorists were much more concerned about environmental things and how those environmental things influence behavior. But the humanists were much more concerned about the control that we have over our behavior. And they felt that control for who we are and what we do really lies within us. It's not up to those environmental conditions or our unconscious mind or anything like that. Instead, they argued that we have free will, that we can become who we want to be, but they did point out that environmental conditions can play a role in a lot of that stuff. But one of the basic ideas behind humanistic theory is the idea that humans are basically good and that we're all striving to live up to our potential or experience what they called self-actualization. But sometimes there are things that get in the way and make it difficult for us to do that, for us to live up to our potential. Now, one of those early humanistic theorists was a gentleman named Abraham Maslow. And chances are, again, some of you may have heard of Maslow before. You may have heard of his hierarchy of needs. He suggested that human needs can be classified in terms of a hierarchy, with the most basic needs at the bottom and higher level needs at the top. And he argued that we can't be concerned about any of these higher level needs until we have these lower level needs met. That we may be striving to get up here, but we have to have these lower level needs met before we can progress up the pyramid. And while we may all be striving for self-actualization, he argued that most of us are caught up in one of these earlier levels, and so that most of us don't necessarily achieve self-actualization. So those are some ideas that we'll come back to a little bit later in the semester. Another one of those humanistic theorists, early humanistic theorists, was a gentleman named Carl Rogers. And Rogers, like Maslow, believed that we're all striving for self-actualization. And he argued that experiences that we have can certainly influence how we work towards that self-actualization. Rogers was a therapist who developed a type of therapy called client-centered therapy. And in client-centered therapy, he argued that the client or the patient should take the lead role and talk about things that they wanted to talk about, deal with issues they wanted to deal with. But Rogers felt that the therapist plays a pretty important role in terms of what the therapist shows or how they interact with that client. He believed that therapists should show these things in their interactions with their clients: unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. And he argued that if people experience that in their relationship with their therapist, even in their relationships with other people, that would help them to come closer to self-actualization, and that would allow them to develop into what he called fully functioning persons. And that's another idea that, again, we'll come back to later in the semester. So those are some of the more traditional perspectives in the history of psychology. Now, as we got into the 20th century, people really started to, as we got into more of the later part of the 20th century, people started to once again pay attention to the mind. And part of the reason for that might have been the fact that there were people like the humanists who, even during that period when John Watson and B.F. Skinner and others, especially in American psychology, were really focusing on behavior as far as our subject matter, there were those people like the humanists, people like Rogers and Maslow, who were talking about more internal type stuff and experiences like self-actualization and that kind of thing. And so it's argued that some of their work may have paved the way for what came to be known as the cognitive revolution. And again, the cognitive revolution got started in the mid to later 20th century as people started to refocus on the mind and mental processes. One of the people who was particularly influential in that cognitive revolution, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky believed that in psychology we need to focus on mental functioning, and that by focusing on mental functioning, that would allow us to develop better understanding of human behavior and why people do many of the things that they do. And of course, Chomsky is not a psychologist, he's actually a linguist. But his ideas had a significant impact on the field. And so while that cognitive revolution got started in the mid to late 20th century, there were a lot of things that happened along with that sort of brought us into more contemporary psychology. And some of the perspectives that make up contemporary psychology will be the subject of our next lecture video.